And we have MPs here to discuss with me in the studio. Conservative MP Aaron O'Toole, Liberal Mona Fortier, and in Toronto, New Democrat Nathan Cullen. Mr. O'Toole, let's start with you. What did you hear from Ambassador McCallum today, and do you think he is doing enough to resolve this situation?
Well, we appreciated that he came and spoke to a parliamentary committee, but it confirmed in our impression that there's been no plan with respect to the China dispute going back to late November, early December, when the Prime Minister was informed ahead of the arrest of a Chinese citizen, and no plan now. There's certainly two Canadians that are getting minimal consular visits. There's one who's had a death sentence imposed instead of a 15-year sentence. And we know there's dozens of other visa administrative detentions, people being pulled off aircraft. There's a sense with rhetoric from the ambassador from China here in Canada, it's a dispute that is descending in a very bad direction. There's potential for other people traveling or working in China being detained. The Prime Minister holding back makes no sense. He's calling other world leaders to try and enlist them in our cause, as he says, but our cause should be forcefully making our case to China for our citizens, for proper treatment with them. So he seems to be holding back for a photo op at the end of this. We'd like him to get involved now.
The rhetoric is really heating up. We heard from, as you say, the Chinese ambassador yesterday decrying what he was calling microphone diplomacy, telling Canada, both sides, to take the rhetoric down. Nathan Cullen, is the Canadian government striking the right tone here in those talks?
There seems to be an impression, at least with the Chinese government, that they can threaten Canada, they can dictate what we're allowed to do, talk to our allies or not, that they can arrest Canadians, detain Canadians, that they can have a Canadian who has been arrested on one charge with one sentence and then move that sentence up to a death sentence, and that Canada's response is going to be relatively meek. And I don't know why China has that impression of Canada or this government. It's got to change. I think Mr. Trudeau is long overdue with a direct phone call with his counterpart, the head of the Chinese government, and that these threats that continue and the insults that, what did they say yesterday, that Canada could count its number of its allies on one or two hands? The China feels like they can push us around and that they can arrest Canadians, that they can put Canadians on death row, and the most they're going to get from our government is let's continue to talk. And I'm not sure that approach is earning the respect that we need to earn to release these Canadians, which should be all of our focus and attention right now.
Yeah, Mr. McCallum said today that elevating this to the leader level, having Prime Minister Trudeau contact Chinese President Xi Jinping was an arrow in the quiver, but one they're holding back a bit. Do you think that's the right way to go?
Well, I think that is, we're now talking about the highest levels of diplomacy. Let's be assured that what Mr. Trudeau has tried so far hasn't worked. As Aaron said, the Trudeau government was tipped off that this high-level ranking executive from Huawei was going to be detained on an extradition order as she entered the country. It just doesn't seem like there was much of a strategy, suspecting what the reaction was going to be from the top of the Chinese government. As Mr. Trudeau said today, they're interfacing now. The government interests and the so-called private interests of this large company. But that has been China's way for more than 20, 30 years now. So it wouldn't have taken a rocket scientist to figure that out. And they just haven't seemed to anticipate China's reaction at all on this. And this is coming from a Trudeau government that wants a free trade deal with China and has been telling Canadians, don't worry, we can trade and deal with China and they'll respect the rule of law, when that is clearly not the case.
I want to get Ms. Fortier in here. One of the things that the Chinese ambassador raised yesterday was his objection to Canadian government officials, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, calling world leaders trying to rally support against China. They consider that to be fairly provocative. Is that really a strategy that the government thinks is going to work? It seems to really annoy the Chinese and isn't de-escalating this in any way.
Well, first, Canada needs to know that we're working very hard. Our goal is to get these Canadians back safe and sound in Canada. So to get there, and we also, as a country, believe with the rule of law and due process, we are taking action. And you heard earlier, Minister Freeland and the Prime Minister Trudeau are taking some actions to go through diplomatic channels and work with our allies to get to that goal that we are really desperately wanting to get to.
Right. Now, McCallum noted on his way into that meeting there are 150,000 Chinese students currently studying in Canada. Chinese tourism is booming, and there is the trade relationship. McCallum had this to say about the possibility of free trade talks with China.
We are certainly not negotiating free trade with China either before or after this problem. So it's not on the table right now.
The Chrétien government was really skilled in its dealings with China at separating the economic piece of it from the human rights complaints, especially after the Tiananmen Square massacre. That is not what Mr. McCallum seems to be suggesting here. It seems that, he's saying as long as we don't solve this, the free trade talks are on hold. Is that the right approach?
Well, one thing we need to realize, we're in 2019 now, and there are many, many new factors, and I can't compare with what was happening in Chrétien era, where we're today. We have really a lot of criteria we have to work with. So I think that we have to really move and make sure that we concentrate to get our Canadians back safe and sound in Canada, and take into account that there are different criteria that we have to take under consideration.
Yeah, Mr. O'Toole, this is the world's second largest economy, and now we have cases of 3 Canadians. That seems to be jeopardizing our trade relationship with them. Is it appropriate to make the linkage between the two, or should these be discussed on separate tracks?
We should always be frank with China, and that's what Mr. McCallum said in his departure speech, that Canadian leaders have always been frank with China. Well, now we're not being. I was startled by the Prime Minister's comments that he's surprised by the blending of Chinese commercial interests with political interests. We've been talking about state-owned enterprises, including Huawei, for several years. This is how China does business, and this is why we've had concerns with Huawei and others. There is a blending. In fact, the Chinese executive, the CFO of Huawei, is considered almost state royalty because of this blending. So the Prime Minister says he's startled by this. He should have known that at the start. He needs to pick up the phone. There is no excuse now. He can't wait till this is in a better position. Leadership is about stepping up to drive forward a solution and to respect the rights of our Canadian citizens.
Nathan, a quick question to you. Imagine you're foreign minister. How do you get us out of this mess?
Well, China has to know that they can't push us around. The top leadership from Canada, and that means the Prime Minister, has to directly engage with the Chinese leadership. And let's remember, Glenn, you've written a lot about this, as has Fife and others, that China deeply wants a good reputation on the world stage. And Canada's sanction of a trade deal was very important to China, yet they're working exactly opposite to their own self-interest. China needs to be reminded of that, because conducting themselves this way, threatening to execute Canadians, is not a way to earn them any respect or any new trade deals. It was the first Trudeau that opened up the door to trade with China that many years ago, and it might be the second Trudeau that may have to close that trade opportunity with China because of the mishandling of this relationship.
Okay, thank you all for coming in. I expect we'll be hearing from you again on this in coming weeks and months.
Thank you.